welcome. Okay, so we have a quorum of members who are dialed in. I think we're still waiting for a couple other people from the school committee to dial in, but we're going to get started. Thank you all for joining. Hope you are all well and healthy. Always the first question I ask these days, because even though it seems like we're supposed to be past the peak of this thing, we somehow are still finding new people every day whose families and loved ones are getting hit. So I hope you all are able to be here, present mentally, since not physically, of course. Okay, so we do have some minutes, but I think we'll wait until David joins to do the minutes. Maybe we can start.
I'm here.
Mary Ellen.
He's here.
You are here, David. Okay, great. Okay, great. So we, I think the minutes got sent, Robin, a couple days ago, right?
Yes, I think they went out with a meeting notice.
Okay, great. Were there any amendments or any other thoughts? Okay, if not, we will go ahead and approve them. It's the May 11th minutes, I think. So do I have a motion?
I move that we
Okay,
approve
Suzanne?
the minutes.
Okay, good. Good. Suzanne, David. All right, so we'll take a roll call vote. Suzanne?
Yes.
David?
Yes.
Karen? I think she's still working on it. I will vote yes. All right, so we have two things on the agenda today, the FY21 budget and the FY20 budget. I think we want to spend a lot of our time just understanding the FY20 budget, where we are. We do have some time in executive session later on today to talk about some more specifics, but I think even just giving folks the overview of where we are would be really helpful before we kind of get to the FY21 piece, which also has both an executive session and an open session component. So Mary Ellen, can we start with FY20?
Sure. Let me, it would be helpful to share my screen.
Helen and Janet, oh, now you're on mute. Okay, great.
So I need to get sharing from Robin. In the meantime, Robin sent out a folder that I shared with the subcommittee, which has 4 PDFs in it, and then 1 Google Sheet, which you have view access to, which is a working document that I'm using to work on balancing this budget. There are, can show it on the screen. There we go. So you should be able to see a file called FY20 Budget Closing Analysis and Reporting. And we, just to go through kind of how this sheet is set up, just want to walk through the columns in terms of what they are, what purpose they serve, and then we can go into some of the details of this. So column A is the projected year budget, and I've broken out, and typically I don't show this detail, but I've broken out the operating budget portion, which reflects the town meeting appropriation and what applies there. And then I also shared and broke out the special revenue offset accounts, the revolving funds and grants that typically those are just shown as revenue offsets, and all the expenses are shown above. I'll scroll down here. So, and then the general summary you see on the bottom here. But the columns at the top, we just want to go through these. So the original appropriation, that's from town meeting in May of 2019. The transfer amounts and adjustments, those are adjustments made within the within the accounts, and the net total of that 30,895 was an adjustment made at the November town meeting. We have a new revised budget, and you'll notice probably in additional reports that revised budget changes from report to report, as our budget managers are typically moving money within our outside services, supplies, other charges, and budgeted capital accounts. The next column is the year-to-date expended, and one of the features I use of our financial application is a feature that allows to catch any and all expenditures. So during the middle of a warrant process, if batches are being posted, I capture those. And same will hold true for the encumbrance and requisitions. I capture anything that's actually entered into the system for requisition as an encumbrance. And so that's our, we currently have around $2.4 million in open encumbrances, and my team is currently working on getting that number down, getting those invoices paid, and liquidating those purchase orders. So then the next column, column G, is the balance that's available as of 5/19. And so we have savings at this point that are appearing in our outside services accounts, our supply accounts, other charges, and the equipment accounts, the budgeted capital. The next column is the one where we're monitoring expenses, and I have that are not necessarily posted, or they are fluid, and those I have in the next tab, which is year-end projection detail. We can get into that more specifically, but those are split between the two. I've highlighted two fields in particular on the special revenue accounts, and I'll get back to that as I finish the columns. So column I basically shows whether we're over or under our budget based on that line item and the projection. The column J is just a summary total of where we're going to be for a projected balance for each of our categories. And K it looks like it repeats, and it does repeat because it's pretty much the revised budget minus the total expenditures and the balance. So the I and K should actually should match. And then those two are actually, those two groupings are summarized below. So it shows where we are for, this is typically what you would see in our budget, where we consolidate all of that into a summary of where we are, and then the revenue offsets and some changes. And I put some things in red that are significant changes in terms of our revenue change this year. That we've talked about in other quarterly presentations. And so right now, we're looking at $1.5 million. It was looking much healthier this morning when I talked to Susan and going through some analysis, but the two items that are of significance right now are the food service deficit. So right now, food service has a current revenue shortfall of $1.7 million. Which is creating a significant deficit in that account. I have a call into Matt and Sasha Palmer, our new food service director, about what is occurring and kind of what is mitigating some of that. What's occurring is that we have payroll. We stopped serving lunch on March 13th, and we've continued to pay employees for their scheduled hours through last week. We are also paying for about 10 employees to work and be paid time and a half to provide free and reduced lunch, students' lunches and meals for the week. And we are, while mitigating our food costs, we are not collecting revenue for those meals at this point. And so the deficit was being masked by the way our accounting system works, where we put a budget number for revenue, and we didn't adjust that revenue number down as we should. So that popped up today. The blue, the 290, is potentially a good news piece where we don't actually have to hold this. The circuit breaker account is the source of these funds, and we can move tuitions that are charged to the operating budget to that account. And as once I hear from student services that those funds are not needed elsewhere, we can remove that as a potential liability and offset and move some of our tuition funds, tuition bills into that, into the circuit breaker fund. So to get in the detail of, so that's I guess I'll stop there, pause, and then we can get into the different tabs I have in this worksheet and walk through kind of where we've had saving, where we've avoided costs, where we have possible offsets that are yet to be determined, and just some other detail of what's driving some of our deficit currently. I think in terms of, I'll stop there.
Yeah, Mariel, just one really quick question on the food services. Is there revenue identified that will be coming in for serving those meals, or is that what's happening with that?
That's my question. One of my questions to Sasha and Matt is that there should be reimbursements that we usually get from the USDA around for meals served, and I know they're making those claims. So generally, we probably lose 30 to 50 cents per meal. But some of those resources have been increased, and there have been supplemental grants. So I need to find out kind of what's the timing of those. So
Okay. I mean, there's a cash question, and timing question, but there's also just how do we think about what we have to compensate for? Like, kind of, it's both in my mind.
okay.
What we think is reimbursable, and then whether it'll come in this fiscal year.
Yep.
As a revenue. Okay. So sort of the bottom line is I'm going to open it up to questions from the finance subcommittee in a second, and then anyone else. But sort of the bottom line is that the whole is roughly 1.5, and we'll talk through some of the savings that you've already captured, but they're in that 1.5. You've already netted them out, so they're not additional. And then we can talk a little bit about some additional where kind of what funds we are still pursuing on a number of different fronts, and then what is what we need to do, what hole we still need to fill.
Okay.
So with that, let me start with Suzanne or David or Sharon. If you just want to come off mute because I can't see your faces right now. Okay, Suzanne.
Yeah, I mean, so what is it? I know we don't know. How do we do this, Mary Ellen, if there is a potential for state or federal money or reimbursements because of COVID-19? And how do we reconcile this if we just don't know what that is? I just don't know how we do this.
Yeah, so the challenge is all in timing, and when those funds come in. Are they committed? When are they committed? When do they come in? So for example, one of the expenses that we're carrying, I'm going to use this one specifically. So we're carrying double time for custodians that are working in our buildings that are open and for cleaning. And so the town is at some point going to be looking, as we close our budgets, they're charging all the personnel costs to the operating budgets of the departments that are incurring it. At some point, we're all going to hit a deficit, and so then they will move that deficit into a separate fund, and to be waiting for FEMA reimbursement and for FEMA claims. So that would be part of our year-end closing, so we have to carry that. And I'm going to be working. Matt and I are going to be working with Virgie Fitzgerald to start pulling that information out and tracking that. Specifically, I'll probably end up with the COVID-19 emergency response tab will start showing exactly what we've spent for cleaning, for overtime, for our custodians in that area, so that we can track and make sure that I can deduct that from our deficit, because that's going to be funded in a different way. So part of it is we're still waiting for guidance from the state in terms of how to do that. So why that's important to pull out and into a separate fund is so when free cash is certified and the tax rate certified, that that deficit isn't included as part of that calculation. There's some accounting pieces to segregate that out. So all of that instruction will be coming in the next few weeks, and by mid-June, I'll have finalized what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to do it. Meanwhile, I want to track it and make sure that we get credit for that expense.
Yeah, I get that. I just don't understand how we can make cuts if we don't know how much money will be coming in to offset.
I mean, the reality is that it's both an art and a science, right?
Okay.
So what happens is that if we're $1.5 million over with 6 weeks left in the year, and there are 3 to 4 external sources that Mary Ellen's going to be pursuing, which we'll see on the next slide. We don't know how many of them will come in, and we don't know if they do come in, at what rates they're going to come in. And there are a number of different line items that she is holding for a set of expenses that she expects, but they're still estimates right now. So I think the answer is, Suzanne, we have to pursue multiple strategies in parallel, sort of not knowing which ones are going to land, because some of them we have to pursue, like making personnel decisions, we're going to have to pursue before we know the answer to some of those other questions. And so, better to be a little bit over than a little bit under, because we can't end not balanced. But it's sort of saying, all right, well, realistically, how much of this do we think we can bank on, and how much do we think we're going to estimate? And we're just going to have to make some decisions about how much of that 1.5 we can go line by line and kind of handicap the likelihood. But I think what's important for Mary Ellen to do for us is to tell us, here are the 6 to 8 numbers that still might change over the next 6 weeks, and we can talk through those. But at the end of the day, it's a judgment call, and we're going to have to make some of the more unpleasant decisions before we know the answer to some of those other questions, because otherwise we end with a deficit, which we can't do. So does that make sense? I mean, it's not a pretty process. But
It's just kind of, going blindly here through, and
well, it's
so,
making educated guesses. It's not totally blind. I mean,
no, I know.
Yeah.
It's just so painful to make personnel cuts, especially if we don't have to.
super painful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
That's why we're doing this in excruciating detail. Yeah. Sorry, Mary Ellen, were you going to say something?
Yeah, and I appreciate Suzanne's comment about making reductions in personnel is because my concern or my fear is in making cuts in personnel ending with a fund balance. And so did I get it right, or did I get it wrong? And there are two sides to that coin, and two people cheering both sides of that coin. Neither one of them feels good. In any case, cheering or no cheering, it doesn't feel good. So that's one of the things to understand, though, is that fund balance will flow to free cash and then is available for appropriation for 22 in the CIP, of which we have, CIP funding, issues and concerns there. So there is kind of a multi-year approach that one needs to think about, in that, what can you do now that will help mitigate issues that you're going to have in 22 a year out, that otherwise you would have to find another funding source for. And no choice is a good choice. No choice feels like it feels good.
On the food services side, is there a deadline by which we would know how much we're going to be reimbursed by the federal government?
I should be able to get some information from Sasha and Matt by the end of this week. We're getting seem to be getting kind of daily updates around every Friday morning with regards to making sure things get are filed and applications and deadlines and guidance. So there's a piece that will get reimbursed, and there's probably a significant piece that isn't going to get reimbursed. But I have to tell you, my strategy is to, whether we figure out how to fund this or not, I will be putting the food service deficit up against the wall, putting it up against the wall to be submitted, and have FEMA and MEMA and the CARES Act all refuse it. Some of it is we may figure out how to fund it, but I still want the taxpayers to receive any reimbursement we can get. So just because we figured out how to fund it doesn't mean we're still not going to file a claim for it. So I also want to make sure you understand that approach, because the taxpayers of Brookline deserve those funds back to be used for other reallocation.
In past years, can you give us a ballpark figure for what amount would be reimbursed in a typical year recently?
So the reimbursement is based on meals sold and served. So I don't have that off the top of my head. We can get that for you, what that revenue is.
Well, it's also that we have it's a totally different calculus this year as well, because we have in these last number of weeks, 14 weeks, we have a totally different calculus in terms of meals purchased, which is 0. In terms of revenue sources, there are new revenue sources that we don't normally have that are emergency revenue sources. Our costs are different because we're not serving the same number of meals. Our labor is different because some of them are at time and a half and some of them aren't at time and a half. So at any rate, I feel like there's a lot of, I'm wondering if prior year, we do often end with a deficit, but I'm just wondering to what extent prior year deficits are even helpful, given so many of the items are changing in this particular deficit, and you have more places to go this year than other years for revenue. Do I have that right?
Yeah, we have relief coming from different places. We have its closure versus a preference purchaser. Yes, I agree with Susan. The calculus in the variables are dramatically different. We're paying employees to be home. We wouldn't be paying employees if we didn't have meals to be served.
The reason I'm asking is because if we're going to have some degree of certainty by the end of the week, what amount we would be reimbursed, whatever that figure is, that would help us understand how much of this 1.5 million we really need to be cutting, because I would prefer, as painful as it is, to err on the side of caution here of having a balanced budget by the end of the fiscal year. But if, for example, the ballpark figure would be we're definitely getting at least 300,000 back, I'm just throwing that out there randomly, then that would mean it's really maybe just 1.2 million we're looking at. I don't want to overshoot by a lot, so that's why I'm trying to get some kind of ballpark figure.
Great question.
I think by the end of this evening, you'll have an idea of a ballpark figure of a variety of different variables. So this is a new wrinkle. That's a big one. But I think we'll be able to get you there, close anyway, I hope, by the end of tonight.
And then in addition to food services, what other areas do you foresee we could get some kind of reimbursement from the state or federal government?
Let me hold on that because we're about to go through that. Mary Ellen, we're about to go through that. Let me just see if that's a great question, David. She's got sheets on that. Are there any other questions? I just want to make sure people understand this page of the cost pieces. Sharon, did you have anything or? Okay, Helen.
Yes. So Mary Ellen, I need a little help with special revenue offset, with that line going across the 51 that says salaries. The original appropriation was 717. And I don't know what the 207,000, but it goes down to the budget of 510. That's only for food services, right?
No, the 510. So let me explain that line. let me
That
first
would be
explain.
really helpful because it doesn't add up to me somehow.
Good. Well, so it's a new, because you haven't seen it this way before. So
Okay.
what this line originally is the tuition offset. So if you look at our revenue down here, materials fee and tuition,
Okay.
that is the original where we charge teachers to this line. And so I reported in the third quarter report that the revenue, the real revenue that goes into that account is 510 and will be around 508 generally. And so I reduced that budget for what we would be charging. So that's that piece. And because normally that would just get absorbed into what you usually see, sorry to move my screen around on you, but to see in this lines 20, the section that's 20 through 26, 27, normally you see all of those pieces sort of merged together. So I broke that out. And the reason why I broke it out is because there have been questions by the committee, rightfully so, around some agreements and, how is it that, we're not in balance? And, we were in balance. And if you look at the upper section, the operating budget, we're in balance, but the problem is we have revolving funds that are pulling us out of balance. Is it food? It's food service. It's beep. It's beep. It's and Premier and beep. So that have pulled our budget out of balance. Because we're responsible for making sure that our operating budget is responsible for funding any negative balances in revolving funds at the end of the fiscal year. So I had been merging all that together, and my attempt is to split it out so that people can see that our operating budget is essentially balanced. But where we're not balanced and where our problem is in our special revenue accounts. And that's where that is. So I pulled that out. So so this is the first time you're actually seeing this section. So let me go through some history around this. Is the the 717 is the materials account, and teachers would typically be charged there. It typically would be 510. You would not see 2 million. There's another sheet that can explain what that 2 million is. And the 17 is the circuit breaker fund, and we charge tuitions to circuit breaker. So that's what's currently charged to circuit breaker, and the balance that's available, and the balance we're holding for tuitions as a potential offset, which would put our operating budget in a surplus at that point.
Just to be clear, that's for outside placement, correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
For special, we typically use it for tuitions because it gets messy using it for it can be used for special education expenses in total. The other accounts, that's just, I have those on record of kind of why. I don't know why those are showing up the way they are, but that's what our reports show. So those are sitting in there and grayed out, and because we're not none of the accounts are being used for supplies or other charges or anything else. It's typically salaries and tuitions. So that's the first time you're seeing that. Normally that would be kind of all merged together in the bottom section if you're looking at it on your own computer. What else can I share?
Why don't we go on to David's question? More questions will come up, I'm sure, but why don't we go on to David's question? If we can go to okay.
So the offsets, the offsets that we're looking at are around FEMA and MEMA, where we would be applying for typically our custodial time for cleaning supplies, food service work to provide lunches. We've had translation services. We've also had software acquisitions as well. And I've put TBD because those are still ongoing efforts on our part. So we don't know what the top dollar amount is going to be. and then also I've put in sort of potentially, I've been told by many, the town, that BEEP would not necessarily be eligible. And I said, we're providing services, we're providing education. We suspended tuition because people were not going to be paying because they were closed. And so can we at least file it anyway and see what happens? We get 50% on the dollar, 50 cents on the dollar, 25 cents on the dollar. That's 25 cents more than we would have gotten if we didn't ask. So I'd rather ask and get 0 or more than not ask at all and get 0. But in columns A and column B, part of, I provided links. I think you should be able to click on those. Those are direct links to the funds, the CARES Act for the town, and what the requirements are for that. I sent I sent that in an email earlier. The CARES Act for the school department, and sort of what the restrictions are for those funds. So currently the advice the town has received is to go after and apply for the FEMA and MEMA money, Justin Casanova Davis is putting that application together on behalf of the town, and we're working with him to get him whatever information he needs to make that application. And then the CARES Act for the town, the recommendation is to hold that. The town is still waiting for some guidance. I think there's been some pushback that the funds cannot be used as a backfill for reduced revenue for 21. Right now it's restricted to the COVID-19 efforts. So first responders, cleanings, and there's some school segments in there that would be eligible, which is why I added technology, software acquisitions, but technology acquisitions are eligible. And so we need to take a look at that as well. And then the CARES Act for the schools is pretty much unlimited in terms of using it for any purpose to support teaching and learning and student learning. So the senior leadership team is working on that. But right now the recommendation is to sort of hold back on using that too soon, because that is potentially a buffer for 21. So we would be looking at making an application of at least $1 million, food service, and it's going to add significantly to that. Custodial overtime is going to add to that. So we would be looking, I'm going to guess it's probably about at least just under $2 million is what we're probably going to end up requesting to be considered for return to the town. Any questions about any?
Well, just to the point that Suzanne was making, I mean, we can ask for anything we want, and I think you're right. It's better to ask and not get it than not ask, but we can't actually bank that $2 million against we still need to make cuts. It's not like we can apply that $2 million to the 1.5 and say we have a $500,000 surplus. So can you just talk a little bit about when that money might be and I agree with the idea of let's apply for what we can apply for and see what we can get, but when would we know, what quarter would we know about MEMA and FEMA in particular, or CARES?
Yeah, so the FEMA and MEMA funds, I believe we would know it's going to be mid to late June. What would end up happening, so I know Justin's finding out they've got one more call this week. I think it's on Friday, where they're going through what the deadlines are to get the applications in and know what when they would hear back on the results of those applications. So I think at least we'll know something in terms of what we will apply for next week, and then also know when we would hear back and be able to make adjustments from there. The CARES Act and this, I don't know about the CARES Act funds and I think the town's going to probably wait till they hear back on the FEMA and MEMA funds before they entertain using the CARES Act funds.
It seems to me if the timetable is mid to late June, that's way too late for us to try to realize these savings. So I think we're in the unenviable position of essentially having to cut, if not 1.5 million, at least pretty close to it.
Yeah, so a couple thoughts. I mean, one is that there's probably some amount of this is the question you raised earlier, David. There's probably some amount of this that we can, reasonably handicap. It's certainly not going to be 100%. But if there's some amount we can reasonably handicap, that would be helpful to know. And the answer may be we just want to go completely conservative and just sock it all away for FY21 because the hole will be big then also. And so, pull the triggers we have to pull now for June, and then we get what we get and we use it to fill sort of the hole for 21. So that's one way to do it. Or we can try to make some educated guesses about for those different line items what we might be able to get. So at any rate, that's kind of the discussion we all need to be aware of. So the answer again, maybe just what you said, stay super conservative. It may be try to make some, estimates. Suzanne or Sharon, do you have any thoughts, or David, any more thoughts?
I do, but I don't know that my, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Sharon.
I do, but I don't know that my thoughts are going to be particularly welcome at this juncture. Given the pending deficit that we're looking at for next fiscal year, I think that going conservative in June is appropriate as a strategy. But I'm also mindful of the fact that this budget reflects, prior to the COVID response, some of the pre-existing sort of structural budgetary tendencies that kind of already existed in our budget. And, I kind of want to just pause a moment and take the opportunity to say that, I remain concerned around the 52, 53, and 55 categories of the operating budget, which still totals somewhere in the vicinity of close to $12 million a year that we're spending on outside expenses. Now, the detailed list of some of those were provided to us a couple of months ago, just for informational purposes, but we never really had the opportunity to dive into them and to talk about whether or not we should be bringing in-house outside services that we're procuring, for different kinds of delivery mechanisms, including within sort of the special context. And I think that there's other issues there as well, some of which have to do with ed tech. I think that some of them have to do with the ways in which we've been using consulting services around professional development and doing partnerships with other kinds of institutions. And while I understand that we have this COVID emergency and that we have this deficit shortfall, I also think that, $1.5 million is reclaimable funds if we can look at some of the deeper structural tendencies within how it is that we do appropriation. Now, I understand that it's late in the year and that the opportunity to have had those discussions may have been a few months ago when we didn't have the opportunity to do it. But I am concerned about the fact that we still haven't had discussions about these 52, 53, and 55 categories either on a line-by-line basis or on a categorical basis, definitely not in the context of sort of broader budgetary planning for the 2021 fiscal year, right? And now we're going into the 2021 fiscal year with sort of the same, structural assumptions about our appropriation. So I know that the issues that I'm raising probably just aren't going to get addressed in, the next couple of weeks. But I really do kind of want to speak to my school committee members and to Mary Ellen and to say, I really don't want I don't want this pattern to continue, as we move through our next budgetary process for 2021. we need to grapple with like how it is that, how it is that we're distributing our expenditures and whether or not there's, structural decisions or policy decisions that we can make that will allow us to bring, some of these categories of expenditures in-house in order to retain as much of our personnel as possible, and maybe stop spending quite so much on things that are sort of outside, um, you know, our kind of core personnel, our core salary category, and see if we could even find some room there and even find like, some, actual, program improvements there. Yeah, I mean, that's basically what I've got to say on that. Over.
So your sort of thoughts on the revenue one is be more conservative rather than less, and just sort of reiterating the idea of kind of going deeper on those line items and trying to figure out what's going on in them.
So I mean, I would still like to grapple with, like, basically when we've been talking about any kind of deficit reduction situation, we've been eyeing category 51, we haven't been eyeing categories 52, 53, and 55 as much, and we haven't gone into deep dives on them. Our solutions have been essentially, who are we furloughing, how are we non-renewing contracts and things like that. And I think that we can be looking creatively for this $1.5 million potentially. I mean, unfortunately, like possibly for next year, right? But like we've already spent the money in the 52, 53, and 55 categories. I was flagging this like, last August, before we even went into our academic year. But like we spent the money we spent, it's gone. So I think that as far as, finding a resolution, yeah, I mean, I think that we need to take a conservative approach because frankly, whenever we get a $2 million FEMA or MEMA reimbursement, it could end up being just sort of appropriated back into the CIP, and it could be end up being appropriated back into the CIP to pay for public health costs that go into the schools, right? Like we don't know where that money is going to go, right? So we just have to deal with the situation.
Okay, Mary Ellen, can you talk a little bit of just to the question of, I agree with a lot of the last set of things you said, Sharon, but just can you back up a little bit maybe to that first page and talk a little bit about the savings that were sort of accrued by freezing the budget?
Sure. So
I think it might address some of what Sharon just said.
Yeah, so on the tab that says avoided costs, it's roughly about $2 million is in there. So athletics, we didn't have any spring athletics season, so there's savings in athletics. So there's some specific spring stipends that I'm anticipating are not going to be expended, so that's about $100,000. Intramurals, which is the spring intramurals portion of the intramurals budget, is not happening. I have a separate tab around substitutes. I think, substitutes is an account that we need to do some analysis on in terms of it doesn't seem quite logical for us to have a $20,000 balance and a $900,000 substitute line at this point in the year when we're not paying for substitutes, but that line has been historically underfunded. And the offsets from leaves by Unit A members has not funded the substitute account like it should, because people on leave are being paid. So the substitute piece needs some attention and analysis. And then I listed, what the savings are that have been absorbed that were available in contracted services, supplies, other charges, and capital equipment. And I am doing some work, and Ben has asked Nicole and Casey to go through their contracted services lines and really kind of get an idea about what what savings there can be, what contracts can be ended. I think to some of the questions that Sharon, you have raised, so that we dive deeper into these accounts and find out, so why are these accounts have balances? And and the tuition piece, and just in terms of contracted services, I want to remind people that of the $11-12 million, about, I think it's between 7 and 8 million of that is either tuitions or contracted services required through an IEP for special education. So once you get past that, you still have only a few $1 million to actually go through to evaluate whether are those services that we can provide ourselves, or are they services we need to purchase outside of the district?
So Mary Ellen, this is Suzanne. I have a accounting 101 question. Can this $2 million in savings, then are we then applying that to our deficit?
Yep.
And so that's already taken care of in the 1.5 million? Is an additional 1.5 million above that? Is that what we're saying?
Yeah. So part of why I showed this column, just go up to column G, is to show you sort of where the available funds were without any, straight on, no information. And that's why I provided you also with the reports out of Munis that shows you that number. And you can see by department what departments are generating funds there. And so that you would see kind of, okay, so we have 16 million. And then I have almost 17 million. I need almost 17 million, but I actually need another 2.3 to deal with our special revenue funds and grants. Or debts down here is I have 17.7 and I need 19. I've applied all the savings to that and I have $1.5 million that I still need. Doesn't quite get me there.
But Sharon, does that answer your question? I mean, what I heard, if I'm understanding this, Mary Ellen, is that 52, 53, and 55 essentially, in the operating budget, essentially froze, and we are harvesting all 1.4 million of that plus more, and we are applying it to these deficits, and we still have $1.5 million. So
Yes.
I'm not disagreeing with your point, Sharon, which is that we have to go through that in more detail, but I do think it's important for folks to know that we already took $2 million of savings of avoided costs this year from those line items before we started talking about anything like furloughs or anything else. So I don't know if that helps. I mean, it's still a long-term conversation, but I just feel like for now, I want to make sure that is that right?
I understand, and I don't want to put together apples and oranges, right? Like, I do think that there's, first of all, I went through the line item distribution line by line of those, of the 50 of the category 52. I don't recall if we were given category 53 and category 55, and we've heard frequently that 3/4 roughly or more of this roughly $12 million is basically going to special education services. But when I went through it line by line, it turns out that a lot of it wasn't, right? And so I just want to say, taking we can't presume that the funds that were not expended due to the COVID emergency, constitute savings in the context of this sort of structural situation moving forward, right? These are two totally separate conversations, right? What I'm pointing out here is that we have a continued dependency on, managing a lot of our spending, using non-core operational appropriations, and we should be looking at shifting that around, and that we shouldn't forget that as we start to think about how we're doing appropriations for 2021. That being said, there's the COVID deficit. I do think we have to be really, really careful. On the one hand, we want to know what it is that we're potentially not going to be expending funds on for next year because of COVID, hypothetically. But that is also a policy decision, and we haven't made those policy decisions yet. Okay?
For next year, yeah.
Taking that out of the equation, we need to recognize that all of that stuff is still baked. There's a bunch of stuff that is still baked in, right? And we need to have a look at what is being baked in and figure out whether or not we can figure out how to institutionalize those funds in a more consistent way.
Okay, any other questions on either the expenses or the costs that we are not going to incur, or some of the things that we're going to go try to get reimbursement from? Anything else on this conversation from school committee members?
Yes, I just have a question about software acquisition and how that works in terms of recouping some of the funds.
So I added that in because as I'm reading the various guidance and what's allowable, software and remote learning and expansion of the technology infrastructure is an item that's specifically stated. And I know that we've done a significant amount of purchasing of software applications and licenses in the last few months as we've moved virtually. So that is actually the net change in our spending in software for the year. So we do actually have line items that are tagged for software, so that's what I pulled. So it's a matter of just submitting. I mean, part of it is if I see an item that's listed that we spend money on, I'm making the request. It's all part of the application process. It's all about throwing Jello against the wall and seeing what sticks.
Okay, Jennifer?
I'm sorry, I just have a procedural question. I see some questions in the Q&A. Will someone be addressing those, or it's on the side of my screen, you know, like in a chat section? Is someone going to be addressing those questions from the subcommittee, or I didn't know how that was going
Well, so I want to start with the school committee questions, and then I'll take other questions.
Okay. No, I think that actually my questions have already been asked, so I don't have any additional ones.
Okay, any other school committee members have questions? Okay, so Mike, do you have a question that you want to chime in with on the CARES Act?
Not a question, just a comment that the understanding that we got from Mel is that the CARES Act funds can only, at this point, can only be spent on direct COVID-19 costs. There's a potential that the restrictions will be loosened so that we can use the money to cover revenue shortfalls, but that's a political decision that has to be made in Washington. That's a difficult thing to forecast, and so I would say that those funds will be restricted and not be. It'd be much better to plan on those funds not being usable to cover revenue shortfalls.
So I just want to share, anyway, read the advisory that came out, because yes, I get on the revenue shortfall, but there are some lines in here around schools, and BEEP is an integrated preschool, which is special education services and support. And so there is a potential tie-in.
Right.
And I'd rather have them rule us out.
Okay.
Anyway, it's worth spending the time to mine for dollars.
Okay.
When it's $970,000, yes.
Yes.
Okay, so anyone else on either the school committee or advisory have a question? Okay, so I think, so Mariah had a question in the chat, which is this the same money that Mel mentioned on Friday coming from the 5.4 million, which I think we just answered? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Anything
it's
else?
all this.
Okay.
It's all the same. We're not. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So then can we go back and sort of ask, I guess my question for the committee is back to this question of, you know, how conservative do we want to be? You know, do we want to be more conservative, less conservative against this 1.5? Obviously, there are going to be things that are information that's still coming in about special education, about reimbursements, about other things that you're holding, funds you're holding in reserve against, you know, potentials for POs that come in once the building's open. I know the secretaries will open their mail, and there might be bills in there, and there's some. I mean, you have some line items in here
Yeah,
against what you can foresee.
Yeah, I did not present that and share that in terms of what I'm including in my assumptions. I can do, let me do that because
Or
I
you
think
could
that will.
you could just tell us. Yeah. Okay. Either way. Yeah.
Let's just show the tab. So there's roughly about $960,000 that I'm holding, the green bars on the tab. So currently I'm holding back roughly about 450,000 to anticipate that there are invoices out there that never got a purchase order or requisition in the system. I deal with this every year, and anticipate that, as the secretaries come back and go through the mail, that those will come through and we will be paying invoices, and that number should drop. I originally started with that number about at 500,000 and have reduced. Some things I knew about have come through and reduced that, and I'll continue to reduce that. I have the 290,000 in here as a holdback because until I hear from student services that they do or don't need these funds, that's a holdback. Those funds would be freed up and I wouldn't hold those back. And then I have unknown and unanticipated, and I'll fix my spelling mistake, is for payroll. That is, I chase every year. I chase pay, add additional pay and unsubmitted hours. And again, I'm hearing right now and late last week about timesheets that weren't submitted way back in March, timely to be paid. So I don't know what those are. Those are coming in and we're making payment for those. And then, payroll in and of itself is an estimate in terms of what is being held for payroll. So every payroll, this number will become more and more refined. And, once the settlement of the BEU hits, the retro pay hits, then we'll be able to much better predict the last two payrolls of the year for them, for the unit A, as well as our weekly pays will still continue to adjust. But the biweekly pays, we only will have two left and be able to pretty much nail those down. Our accrual buyback is a variable. That is pretty much what we spend on an annual basis on our buyback. Employees have a choice at this point to buy back or not buy back. So I will be doing some analysis and study on that with for example, the BEU has an A-day buyback. They haven't had opportunity to use their A-days from March through June, and spring tends to be a frequent time for those to be used. Is that I would imagine we would be doing a buyback, and that's a buyback on those that's higher than usual. So I'll have that information. I'll have that information hopefully finished by the end of next week. And we're getting the buyback requests from our employees at this point. And we will not pay the buybacks until the last payroll. So we know exactly what funding we have. So roughly about 960 of that 1.5 million could go up or down, or begin to fill that hole. It's going to come in kind of some big chunks, though.
But again, we might have none of that, just to the point about being conservative, right? So those are things that are being held. Those numbers may move, but they are based on what you think we may get. Okay. All right. So any other questions? Anything else you want to tell us about FY20? I mean, in the executive session, we're just going to have to make a set of decisions about conversations to have about reducing this budget. Again, just to the point, I think it's a good reminder. We should always mention that we've already found $2 million of savings, and that we are pursuing all these other things, and yet still we sort of have to deal with this 1.5 now. So we'll talk about some choices and negotiating positions and whatnot in executive session. But anything else for now? Yeah, Sharon.
Yeah, I would just like to say that, when we're having these conversations in executive session, those are reductions in the budget that are specific to, I believe, contract related issues. I guess the question that I have is, what conversations can we have about possible reductions that are appropriate for public session that aren't contract related? Is there anything left on the table other than personnel or contractually, like contract related labor, that we can actually discuss here and now? Or are we effectively saying there's nowhere else for us to go in our budget other than contracted labor?
So I think what we heard was that all of the lines that were frozen added up to 2 million, and that was the line items you were interested in. That there are those 3 or 4 places where Mary Ellen is holding some money, and so I guess we could make choices about different amounts she could hold in terms of outstanding POs or something like that. We could, I mean, I'm not sure, Mary Ellen, you can tell us if any of those amounts you're holding could change. And then I think the third thing is the amounts that she's going after in terms of revenue, pursuing different revenue sources. So those last two we can talk about. So it's like 2 million in those other expenses, and it's some, couple million in revenue to go after. Is there anything else on those two? Because yes, we still have 1.5 after that. So is there anything else that we can talk about now?
Well, I think that I guess to add to Sharon and the committee's information is the other part of this whole calculus is that there's 2.4 million in encumbrances in the general fund. And what we are doing and what my team is doing is having conversations with secretaries and budget managers about closing out those encumbrances. So how much of that is really real money going out the door, or can we get the final bill, pay the final bill, and start liquidating those encumbrances? And generally what's been happening in the last few months is those encumbrances have been dropping about $100,000 to $150,000 a month up until this point. So May and June is a time where we really start to see those encumbrances drop because the final invoices start coming in. So those we were trying to get that all resolved by the end of May and try to get those closed out so we can release those encumbrances to fill in that 1.5 million as well. Because we're not allowing people to reuse those funds for another purpose. If they're not for the original purpose, original invoice, original supply of service, it's going back to the bottom line.
So what is the forecast for recapturing the balance after those encumbrances? And is that already here and I just missed it?
So I don't have a forecast of the recapturing what percentage of those encumbrances would get liquidated. I've learned a long time ago not to do that because it's very difficult to forecast. It's just one that I know we need to put a lot of effort and energy into getting those liquidated and getting the bills paid and getting, ideally having those all paid before the end of the year. So there's always been, we're doing that too, because those are unknowns.
And did you say that you would know at the end of May?
I've been asking and hoping we can get at the end of May and get secretaries in, get through the mail, get those invoices in, get them paid, follow up with vendors, finish those out, and really just put a lot of effort in getting those all resolved and paid. I don't know that we'll actually end up paying them all at the end of May, but we certainly will get an idea of which ones are going to be closed and pending an invoice and what's left, and which ones are going to be an invoice is going to come in and there's going to be no residual balance.
So Mary Ellen, I have a question. Suzanne, so you talked earlier about 450,000 for unpaid invoices. Is that also part of the 2.4 million?
No. We have like a lot of places, we have a situation in where people will make purchases, financially obligate the district, but don't actually have the authority to do so. And so an invoice will come and then they do a requisition and a purchase order after the fact. So that's regular occurrence that I need to deal with.
Susan? Yeah. So I'm wondering why the secretaries can't go in now to the buildings. They're safe. I mean, nobody's been in there. There's no virus in them. They could use precautions in terms of themselves so that we can get this number and get it done before,
We're working on that. We're working on bringing employees back and having them back in the buildings. Khalees and Matt are working on that as we speak to be able to have them come into work. So we have been waiting for, some have been waiting for the governor to, sort of the reopening plan. And so now that that's in place, and Matt and I have been working with the town around a reopening plan, and Matt and Khalees are working on that for the school department, bringing that back. We made 2 Clark Road available for mail sorting, safe distancing in early April for those that wanted to come in. Some were willing and some were not. So we're at that point where we need to have people coming in.
Yes. And I would think they could go to their buildings even now.
So that's part of what Matt and Khalees are working on, is pulling them back and getting those buildings. But we're also mindful of making sure that we have custodians that are also willing to come back to work and be in our buildings. You have to appreciate that there are a lot of different feelings that individuals have around their own personal safety and returning back to work. As you can see, I'm in my office. I've been coming in and out during the whole thing. Town hall is immaculate and cleaner than my grocery store. So, so I think it's a matter of people getting used to the idea of coming back in and moving around.
Thank you.
Susan,
Go ahead, Barbara.
or actually Mary Ann, aren't the police and fire departments using the buildings? And is that a problem for people going back in?
So we have police and fire at the Coolidge Corner School. And Matt is working with police and fire so that when they come back in, that they're not there at the moment. The office, for example, for where the fire department is at Coolidge Corner and where the main office is opposite sides of the building, so they can be in the same building. The police department sort of took over the principal's office suite area, so they would need to relocate if the office staff would, or all need to practice safe distancing and coexistence. The office area where the administrative assistants sit is kind of walled off and there's glass. And so Matt and Khalees are working with the principal on those concerns. And that's the only building that they actually ended up occupying, even though we offered our other buildings. Those were sort of preventative, proactive steps in case the police department needed to really split apart and separate. But they've been managing in their own building pretty well.
I think that's helpful because people are going to ask, why do we have additional custodial expenses? And so it'll be helpful to understand what they've been doing during this time that was costing us the time and a half. Mm-hmm. I think it's one thing if the fire department was using 6 of our buildings, but if they weren't, that's important to know also. All right, if there aren't any more questions on FY20, we can move on to FY21. Is that fair?
Sure.
Okay.
So I did locate this. I did a spreadsheet and put it in that folder. Pull it up here. Hold on. I can share this as well. So I did a mock-up after the town school partnership of what our, and I'll make this larger so you can see it. Of kind of what the impact is of the sort of middle projection that the town administrator provided and what that does to our budget. And so essentially it resulted in roughly a 0.25% reduction from our FY20 appropriation. And then also from our original, April kind of budget request, it's roughly about a $6.3 million adjustment we need to make to the budget we're currently working with to reduce that down to that less than FY20 appropriation amount. So there are a number of different discussions around how do we do that, and particularly one of the big questions will be is how are we functioning and operating in September, or from September to January, or from January to June, or September to June. Because as we've learned with virtual learning, we have, we don't have the sort of, high, because we're not in schools. I'll just use BEEP as an example, where that you have paras that are very much involved in the classroom and assisting students, and it's all very much hands-on. Oftentimes called a kind of high touch, but we don't necessarily have that in a virtual world. And so Ben has put Casey and Nicole and Khalees on teams to review sort of the different options of how we would be delivering education and what kind of the needs are, and to look at those. And the committee has had some initial conversations around that. And there will be more to follow as we all sort of try to understand what September will look like. So that's essentially, for us, it's to be at an FY20 level, it means rolling. I'll leave it at that. It's a big impact.
So I think that one thing that'll be important is to understand, when do we think it's possible to have a conversation about those assumptions, simply because I think there are a whole lot of things that need to go into this, both from a public safety point of view, but also from sort of a set of staffing points of view. Mm-hmm. So maybe you can share with us how, more or less, how these estimates were come up with, and then maybe what we can do is have a conversation. There've already been a fair number of conversations, but about what we might need to do to start to estimate these costs going forward.
So I think that's where I think to Mike Salmon's point around the town's CARES Act being dedicated to the COVID-19 expenses, when you read through that list, they're very much about the safety, personal safety and protections, and a variety of different things. And there's language in there around virtual learning and how do you do that and expand that virtual learning and support that. And that's not typically a funded expense. And so to provide resources there. And I'm just speaking to the benefits to the school department. There are other benefits of that 5.2 that I do want to say that, is first responders, is other components of the town that need to run. So I don't want to sound that it's all or should all come to the schools, but where there is a school portion that ties to virtual learning and expanding that in special education and acknowledging special education expenses and how those have to be done differently, as well as food service expenses for providing meals for our low income families, that, that 5.2 helps and assists with that section that supports student learning. So I think that's a piece that is important to look at because that's around safety of employees, PPE for employees, potentially. And so I think that's part of the discussion and the planning around as the town opens and protocols are set, that we kind of look at what are the additional expenses that we need to respond to that, and is that appropriate for the $5.2 million? And what's appropriate then for the $433,000 that the schools have for supporting education in the same kind of light, because it's a little broader around providing supports for student learning. But that's not going to get us to 6.3 because much of our expenses are not, that we have in our budget, are not related to that. So I think we have to look at what is it that how are we providing education, and what are our resources that we need and the time we need to develop that plan. I do want to remind the committee that town meeting makes a bottom line appropriation. So the vote that the school committee would need to make is basically the total revenue, the total general fund appropriation. The decision about the allocation of that doesn't need to happen technically. This is a technical response versus the political response, is that technically the school committee just needs to provide a vote for the total revenue, general fund appropriation. How it allocates those resources technically does not necessarily have to be provided to town meeting. However, politically and historically, that allocation has always been provided to town meetings so that they know and understand where those resources are being used and delivered. So the planning around education delivery in September and reopening in whatever form in September is going to take some significant amount of time and energy by a significant number of people, of which, to Susan's point, the safety of our employees and our students is a factor and needs its own sort of funding stream and source and protocols in place.
So I think it's important for us to have a couple of conversations right now. We have about 40 minutes. This will not be the last conversation, but just sort of to make sure all the ponies are running in the same direction. One of the sets of questions is, what scenarios are we trying to model for next year? We've had conversations about whether or not it's worth modeling a fully reopen the buildings conversation, if anybody thinks that's a remote possibility or not, or whether everything is going to be in some hybrid form, whether or not, under what circumstances it would, what would have to be true in order for us to open the buildings. We've had that conversation both at school committee and at the task force. And, looking at the CDC guidelines, the headline is that it would be enormously expensive and difficult. So it's just sort of worth thinking a little bit about that. And then I think the last piece of it is what's the information that we will have by when to be able to have this conversation sort of both with the town and with town meeting, because for sure there's a lot of work that's going to be happening in the next couple of weeks, but we are going to have to send out a budget to town meeting in advance of having work completed that is going to be continuing over the summer. And so I think just sort of how we approach that is important, and how we partner with the town, specifically the public health folks of the town, but the whole town, to think about how much it's worth investing and at what point to try to reopen the schools, because it wasn't a school's only decision to close the schools. It won't be a school's only decision to open the schools, because as wonderful as our nurses are, we simply do not have the kind of public health experience that we would need to be able to make that decision and run through all the traps and all the protocols. So, with that, I think, again, in an ideal world, we would have a lot more planning time under our belts before we tried to put together a budget. But we don't have that, so I just kind of want to open it up to the committee a little bit and get some thoughts as to how to proceed in an environment where there are really pretty wild swings in terms of what's possible. Sharon?
So I want to say, can you just confirm, can you hear me? I just switched devices. Okay, thanks. So I just want to say, like, I think you're being wonderfully diplomatic, but I also think that we probably have, at this point, like, as much information as we need in order for us to start understanding who the decision holders are and where the decisions need to be made. And I think that, you know, first of all, like, it's very clear that a full return scenario is definitely off the table for September, right? It may not be for January, but it's definitely for September. At that point, that leaves us with two models, right? We have a hybrid model and we have a remote learning model. And we have what we're looking at as being something like a $6.2 million budget deficit, okay? And we need to understand that, like, and I'm sort of taking the opportunity to speak to the broader audience here, and that includes the attendees who are in the participant category. There seems, based on my interpretation of the town school partnership conversation that happened last week, we need to understand that the decision to go to a hybrid model is fundamentally a public health decision, and it's not a school programming decision, okay? And the costs that would need to be incurred in order to go to a hybrid model are public health costs. They are not school programming costs. If, for example, in order to move 1,000 people back into a building for daily interaction with children, you know, and between children on a day-to-day basis, we would need to reinstate workplace COVID testing twice a week in order to ensure that we're catching transmission as it's happening, okay? That's not something that we can fit into a school-based appropriation, right? If we're talking about having to buy enough face masks for every single student and staff member for every single day of the school year, taking into account the fact that they will be ripped or destroyed, you know, and having to do that in a context in which there is literally a global scarcity of face masks, that is not something that the schools can absorb as part of the educational programming budget, right? And so I think one of the things that we need to be really thoughtful about here is the fact that we have a COVID, I just want to say you mentioned the word task force, but you didn't specify the COVID task force, not the remote learning task force. The COVID task force is going to need to make a determination about whether or not, you know, or at least they're going to need to have a conversation with all of the stakeholders in town, this committee, the broader school committee, the select board, you know, the advisory subcommittee, and in fact, town meeting, about whether or not the town is willing to furnish the public health expenses that are going to be required in order to facilitate a safe hybrid model, right? And based on that determination, the schools are then going to have to make a decision about whether or not the resources that are being committed towards a hybrid model are going to rise to our threshold of what's going to constitute safe and functional educational programming, right? And so what I think we need to do is we actually need to take like a little bit of a step back, and we need to stop saying there's $5.4 million over here, there's $6.2 million over here, and if we slam them together, you know, can we go back, can we go into a hybrid model, right? What I actually think is that we're probably, if you factor in the need for testing and surveillance and communications and PPE and, you know, frequent cleaning along the standards that have been set by the CDC, you know, which can be like, you know, full deep cleanings every single day, multiple times a day of major areas, take into account also additional, you know, possible reductions in revenues, because it's not likely that we'll then also be able to return back to a situation in which we're renting buildings. We may not be able to return back into a situation in which we can have extracurricular activities, which generate some degree of income for janitorial income. Like, we need to have a realistic conversation about the fact that we're not looking at a situation in which, you know, $5.4 million is probably going to be enough to cover the total of the town and schools hybrid return, right? I mean, this is like, you know, the CDC guidelines are out there, right? There's no surprises that are coming about what the likely, you know, what the likely conditions are going to be for a a hybrid return scenario that includes social distancing. There's some questions about how we can fit that into an educational program, right? Like whether, we don't know, like even if we could put into place all of the PPE, all of the sanitation, all of the testing, et cetera, we still don't know if we as schools can put teachers in the right ratio in classrooms at the right time within our contractual limitations in order to enable sufficient social distancing that would then allow for, you know, functioning education. Like we just don't know that. We haven't done that level of analysis because we don't even know if the town is willing to furnish the funds that to meet the preconditions for reentry in the first place, right? And so I think that like we do need like that, and that those funds like that, if that's going to be $4 million, $6 million, $8 million in just operational expenditures to maintain a minimum public health safe environment for kids and staff so that we don't create huge centers of transmission in the community, you know, we need to have like that funding can't come from inside the school's budget. We cannot be in a situation where we're laying off teachers in order to buy face masks, right? That's not how this can work. We don't even know how to procure. We don't know how to procure like gigantic quantities of PPE and face masks and tests. That's not what we do as schools. We need to kind of kick back our understanding of the town-school partnership split here back to some kind of coordination within the context of the COVID-19, you know, town-wide coordination task force and start to ask some fundamental questions because frankly, and this is just a fundamental set of budgetary questions. If the town can't afford to reopen the schools, then I don't know that we should be spending a lot of time planning for a possible hybrid model in September. We have enough information available to us to know whether or not the town is interested in prioritizing the reopening of schools. But there is going to need to be like some, I mean, and I said this at the task force, you know, generally speaking, we don't look to the town to make programmatic decisions about what happens in the schools. This is a scenario in which the town's decisions around public health are predeterminate for making determinations about whether or not we go back in or we don't. And so that's what I've been thinking about now. And I think that, you know, given the enormous burden, that we're confronting, if we're looking at a remote model, you know, a remote model offers the opportunities to cut certain costs. It's also going to involve possibly a lot more upfront expenditures, especially around professional development, you know, as well as like some other things and possibly summertime expenditures, right? In order to like deliver a minimally functional educational program, you know? So I think that we just need to kind of ask ourselves, like, are we being honest and forthright here about who the decision holders are, where those conversations need to happen and how quickly they can happen? Because I don't know that if we keep punting this off week to week at additional, like, you know, town school partnership meetings, that we're going to get to where it is that we need to be in order to like plan accordingly so that we can use the budget that we have in order to deliver the best educational program that we can by September. Over.
All right. Thank you, Sharon. Anyone on the school committee have anything they want to add, subtract, multiply, divide? Otherwise, I'm happy to just open it up to advisory committee members as well.
I mean, just to comment, Susan, if you don't mind, Suzanne.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I think that we need to come up with some number, you know, as Mary Ellen said, for our appropriations. And we're going to have to continually revisit and revise the formula, the budget as we go along, because we don't know right now what those demands are going to be on our budget in terms of whether it's going to be remote, hybrid, or back to class. So I don't think we can answer all these questions, but we are going to be required to come up with some number that we're requesting for the budget. So I don't quite know how we do that, but.
Barbara?
I think that we really have to become aware of how big this problem is. Because as I listen to Sharon, I get the feeling that she's talking about the town being willing to put the money into doing what needs to be done. And my first question would be, is the town going to have anything near the money that we're going to need? Because when you think about what's coming into the town now and what's not coming into the town financially, it's pretty amazing. Restaurants are closed, stores are closed, all of that kind of revenue. That's partly what the town, in large part, what the town depends on, the tax money that they get from that. So that's one of the things. And then the other thing, I think this whole business about, I think we need, I guess what I'm saying is I think we need a town conversation that is not just about money, because aside from that, you have parents who are going back to work now. And if we do a hybrid model where we only have some of the kids in school, some of the days of the week, like one group comes Monday, another group comes Tuesday, or they switch morning, afternoon, that has a huge impact on families. So that whole piece of how we decide to teach needs to be vetted in the community so people have an understanding of what the issues are going to be that are in large part childcare issues, because there's not, it's going to be different than it would normally be. So I think we need that to think about. And I also think that when you think about this, if you have a teacher who has, some days she has some kids there, some days it's a different group. When the ones are home, you still have to think about that. That is a very, very different kind of planning than most teachers are thinking about. Because when you have a group of children there, you plan for those children. But if you've got another group you've got to think about that are home, that's like almost having a second group, although it can be fixed so that it's not quite so drastic as that. But I just think that the questions around what we're going to do are much larger than budget. Budget being a huge one, but I think there are many, many more issues that we need to think about, because I think going back in a different model brings up different problems, and different problems not only for the schools, but for the parents and the town. And I think it's a discussion that we have to get moving in the town about what not only we see that needs to be done, but what the town, the members of the town see, what the parents see. I just think I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface.
Jennifer?
So I feel like, well, I'm wondering perhaps if the first layer, I'm sort of responding to Sharon and Barbara's thoughts. And, you know, I think we need, if we're sort of assuming here that we can't go back full time in the fall as planned. Or maybe the question is, what would that, I don't know. So I guess if we're talking about a hybrid plan, we need to know if we can afford to do that. And so I do think that needs to be a town conversation. But I also agree, so I'm agreeing, I think, with Sharon that I don't think, if we don't know that sort of rules out a whole bunch of paths, right? If we can't afford to pay for all that PPE and to the cleaning and all of that expenditures, and we don't have the money, and we're not gonna be able to get the town, you know, the town doesn't have it, to Barbara's point, and the money is not there, we can't do that. We shouldn't spend time planning for something that we know we can't do, and that we should spend our energy planning for what we think we might be able to do. And that could look like several different versions. And I also want to sort of reiterate Barbara's point that we really do need to think very carefully and to include a lot of the community in our thought process as much as we can about what a hybrid model might look like. And I think lots of people, we want to get kids back to school. Lots of people want that, but people really need to understand the ramifications and what it will actually look like to do a hybrid model, and how complicated that can be for families, and coordinating all of that. And there are still going to be lots of expense that we need to plan for in doing that, for PPE, for cleaning. We're going to have revenue offsets, and reductions. I don't know. There's a lot to go here, but I do think there are two important pieces for me of this, which is one, we need to know what we can and cannot afford to do and whether or not that shuts off certain avenues for us. And then secondly, really making sure that we have thought through all of what teaching and learning will look like in that hybrid model is very, very different than either what we've been doing now and what we were doing before we closed. That's all.
Ellen?
So I agree with all three speakers, Sharon, Barbara, and Jennifer. Those are issues. Just add another little wrinkle in all of this is we also need to understand what the communities around us are doing, because many of our teachers live in the communities around us. And if we're doing a hybrid system, but the other communities are doing remote, those teachers aren't going to be able to come to school. And also the opposite. If we do only remote, I mean, it affects everybody's system, affects the others. And I assume we'll get some guidance from the state in addition to public health people, but it's going to be very complicated till we figure this out. I don't think there are going to be any easy answers here.
I'm happy to reiterate what I said a couple of meetings ago. I don't know, I'm on these meetings every single day, so it's a little hard to apologize if I'm repeating myself, anyone, but I think I said this last week. I think there's 0% chance we're going to be back in the buildings fully in September. And my thought last week was I don't think we should have a task force built around that, because I think those people should get redeployed. It's not my decision, it's the superintendent's decision, but that was sort of where I thought last week, and I still think that. I think having absorbed some of the, last Thursday and Friday, having absorbed more of the CDC guidelines, and then this weekend sort of reading them in further detail, we could spend a fair amount of time convincing ourselves that it's unbelievably expensive to reopen in September, and potentially we should do that to satisfy ourselves. But I also think that that's not a school committee decision. I think that's a decision that has to be made by, I think we were saying this earlier, the COVID task force, which is the one that ended up recommending we close in the first place. And so it would be helpful to have that group weigh in on under what circumstances. I mean, it's a staff group, it's a staff leadership. If you all remember, it's Mel, Ben, head of public safety, police, fire, and somebody else, Mary Ellen, you can tell me who else is on it, or somebody else. DPW maybe? I don't remember. And Swanee Jet, I think, shares it.
Dr. Jet.
At any rate, I'm sorry?
Dr. Jet was on.
Yeah, I think he chairs it. At any rate, I think, we need some, that group is the group that we as elected officials collectively need to ask kind of the question of, given these CDC guidelines and given where things seem to be headed, under what circumstances and how much would it cost to try to have any sort of hybrid opening in September? I mean, we can certainly make some guesses, but until we have someone professional actually telling us that, then that's, it's very hard to do. I mean, the good news is that we have a fair number of people in this town who are, public health experts, and they're on CNN. And I'm like, wait, you're a parent at Pierce. So that's good news, and we should be able to leverage that expertise in the community to help us frame these questions. But if I had to guess, I would say that both logistically, in terms of spraying down children and, sanitizing every crayon after every kid used it, my guess is we were not going to end up even in a hybrid model. But, that's not my decision alone to make. But I do think that we need, to ask collectively as a group of elected officials. I think we have to ask that task force to look at the CDC guidelines, and just as they gave us a recommendation about closing school, give us a recommendation about what it would take to open it back up and how much it would be, And I think we need some, as we said it last week, the school committee decided that we kind of wanted some expert task forces that were, to ask for that feedback from the community. So I think we need that as well. All of that, I feel like is a joint school town project. I think there's a separate set of questions that are schools in particular, which are around the professional. Let's assume that under any scenario, we're going to have some decent amount of distance learning. And by the way, remote learning, distance learning. And by the way, that at any point in time, even if we do open the buildings, they could shut down again for 2 months, the drop of a hat. So having some sort of sense of not only what the educators need in terms of professional development and skills, what we need in terms of technology, all that sort of thing, but also kind of what the curriculum is and what how we're gonna adjust what we're teaching to that environment, and then finally how we're going to deal with sort of the whole child in terms of mental health, extracurricular. There's like a lot of other things that we are responsible for besides just academic learning expectations. And so to the extent that those 4 sort of categories, one of which I think is a town school project jointly about the public health implications and operations and all that. And then there are sort of a set of things that I think we said last week, but I think it's just becoming more and more clear that we probably would love, help from the community on. It's not to replace the work that the working groups are doing. They're doing important work. I just think it might help, kind of, if we are clear about the questions that we have, I think that would probably be all to the good. So let me stop there. Sharon?
I mean, I just want to build on what you're saying, Susan. I think it's really important to note that, like, the more that we delay making these very difficult decisions under what are an increasingly clear set of parameters, the less time that we as a committee have to make decisions about what our priorities are and what our values are around what constitutes quality remote learning. I have to say, like, I don't know what constitutes quality remote learning at this time. This is a whole new area. And we're going to effectively have to retool an entire system in the space of 3 months with the vast majority of our staff not here, not available to us for work because they go home on the last day of school on June 23rd. So we effectively have between May 19th and June 23rd to set clear expectations and start putting wheels in motion for summertime professional development and retooling and re-equipping, in order to get schools open in September. Because regardless of whether or not we go to a hybrid model or a remote learning model, the one thing that we do know is that some kind of instructional delivery will still be required. And we, as a town of Brookline, still have an expectation that we're going to do it well. So we don't really have a month for a long, deliberative process with, town staff while they reflect upon their options to consider whether or not they're going to go with model 1, model 2, model 3. I think that the issue is just that, like, there needs to be some prioritization here.
Yes, I love how Mike Salmon writes, I have a comment, which is helpful. I'm really excited because maybe it will be, maybe he'll crack the case and he'll give us the answer that once he comes off mute as to how we're going to tie it all up.
Okay,
We have about 15 minutes left, by the way. Yeah, please.
All right. Well, it'll be a very brief comment. I think there's a tremendous risk that you can be frozen by the lack of clarity that you've got in front of you. And a couple of things that are very clear. That there's going to be a substantial shortfall compared to the funds that you thought you were going to have. That there are going to be some additional expenses and potentially some additional savings from whatever model you choose. Probably the most sensible thing to do is to develop a couple of different scenarios within the revenue envelope, that you can see. It will be very difficult for the town to come up with additional money beyond whatever CARES Act money we can allocate, because the town is also facing a similar sized cut in the services that it provides. So the piggy bank is going to be broken open, and most of the coins are going to be spilled out in order to bridge that gap. And the idea of an override is an interesting idea, but that's not a short-term solution. and it's not a certain solution either. So I would suggest that you not get too frightened. It's easy for me to say because you're the ones who have to come up with the scenarios. But it's really important not to get too frightened to get frightened into inaction.
Let's take yourself off mute. Yeah.
Yeah, I did. So I agree with what Michael has said. At the same time, to be fair, I think it's always helpful to the extent it can be done, at least for analytical and informational purposes, to have an idea of what kind of cost would be required to do the type of program that Sharon was talking about, because people are going to want to know, and I think it will be informative. Whether or not there's some trick someone can find up their sleeve, who knows? That wasn't me. But it certainly is worth everyone having the data. So.
Yeah, and I think part of the
Absolutely
question is like we're going to have to open at some point, right? So theoretically,
No,
at some point we'll be opening. Yeah. So we need that information at some point. I think part of the question is how do we prioritize time between now and September? Do we not that we don't need what you said? I totally agree. We need it. I think it's important to have a conversation about how we prioritize time like now, and then what we do kind of October and following sort of thing. So you might want to clarify that, and then Janet.
I have just one last question for everybody, and that relates to potential liability for the town and the school system from either employees or the families of students. If someone goes in and they get the virus and something really bad happens, because we're seeing things in children that I don't think people anticipated just 3 weeks ago. If we have not spoken to town council about this, I think it needs to be something that is focused on.
Thank you. I agree with that. Janet?
I'm going to say something very unkind.
Can you speak up a little bit? We're having trouble hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
If you speak up, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm going to lean right into my little device here. I'm going to say something very un-Brookline. I agree with the comments that have been made, but you don't have the time to invite the level of town and parent and everyone participation that Brookline is used to having. And I think your time would be better spent preparing messaging that explains why we're going to have to turn the process we usually use on its head in order to have a budget, and then say things as we get through our planning. You're invited in. It's not an engraved in stone, but it's something we have to put together. So it's sort of the Mary Ellen Norman, it's not the political way to do it, but you don't have time to do the level of engagement. Sandy sent something out that the books are going out June 6th, I think. That ain't going to include a budget, but you don't have much time after that. So I'm just glad I don't have to make decisions that you guys do. You're going to have to pay your money, make your choice, and then go forward as best as you can from that point.
We have about just under maybe 8 minutes left before we need to go into executive session for some of the pieces that we talked about earlier. I would be grateful if we could have a brief discussion about timing, I think it was a great segue, Janet. So I understand that the combined reports are supposed to be going out June 6th or whatever that date is. That's also the date, I think. So if I sort of rewinding the clock, we had talked about having this conversation tonight, having a public presentation on May 27th, which is next Wednesday, and then having a school committee public hearing on the 4th. that's the following week, but the 4th is when the reports are supposed to go out. And so, and then typically after the public hearing, we have a vote. So that would be not the 11th, but, our last meeting of the year, which will be the 18th, which is clearly, beyond, well beyond acceptable given that, given when town meeting is. So just to the point that, Janet just made, I think it would be helpful to also think about realistically, what could we do by when in order to have the best possible conversation we can have at town meeting, recognizing all these factors. So if anyone has any brilliant ideas, I'm happy to talk to Mary Ellen after this, but I would love to solicit some input. Yeah, Mike.
Well, I think taking up Mary Ellen's comment about how the school committee needs to set an overall budget, whether that budget is 119 million or whatever the allocation is that is requested from town meeting, so the town meeting can make that allocation. That certainly is the first step. If you then have to take more time, even after town meeting, to figure out what to do, how to allocate those funds in order to get some of the answers, take some time in order to get some of the answers to the questions you're asking about hybrid model, what's the scenario. I think that is probably the best way to proceed, because you certainly need the gross number. And you'll spend a certain amount of time figuring out what that is. That's the first priority that you've got.
Paul?
I'm off mute. So I just, as I hear this conversation, it's a very complicated situation. And I don't expect, as a parent, as a town meeting member, and as an advisory committee member, that you're going to have the complete engineered solution for us by town meeting. But what I would like to hear by town meeting or before is how you're going to be nimble. How are you going to build flexibility into whatever system you have at your disposal, contractually, services-wise, systemically, even the partnership with the town, so that as circumstances change, we will have the flexibility to deliver the services to students that we need to deliver. Flexibility, I think, is really key here. And if you go down one path of teaching on site, that takes away some flexibility. If you purely go the other way, if you're a hybrid model, I think ultimately flexibility in how we can deploy resources, reuse resources, allocate resources the first half of the year, differently in the second half of the year, I think are going to be really important.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, it's just one other thought.
Yeah.
I think that as we're crafting our budget, it is important to work within our means. I'm not comfortable assuming that we're going to get any extra money, given that the town is also experiencing the shortfall. Obviously, the number 6 million has been tossed out as the rough amount of cuts that we would need to make. And if we're able to get some money from the state or federal government, that would be great. And then we could take Paul Warren's advice and be nimble enough that we could find a way to utilize that money that comes back. But it's not something we can assume. That should not be our default assumption. We should assume that we're not going to get anything and then hope for better.
I mean, I think so. Yeah. So yes, I appreciate that as being one of the scenarios. I think the likelihood that we will be able to pull off any of this with a $6 million budget cut is like, it's worth thinking about whether that's even possible, whether it's, if that makes sense. I mean, a $6 million budget cut. Yeah, please.
I was going to say, we're going to have to find a way to make it work, because we have no guarantee that anyone is going to supplement our budget. So I think in any type of contingency planning, you always want to plan for the worst case scenario. So that worst case scenario sounds like it would be a 6 million cut. So we need to be ready to offer something at that level. And then we can also, to Cliff Brown's point, have various other contingency plans that we can at least show and present what it is we would do if we had a budget level at X amount, what we would do at Y amount. But I think we need to have that all in place because we can only ultimately control what's appropriated to us.
So just one thing for everyone to realize, when we're talking about a $6 million cut, it's $6 million off of a budget that was more than the budget that we're working with this year. It's really essentially a level funded budget when you look at it. That's the amount of money that's going to be available. So it's that the marginal increase that was budgeted isn't going to be there. But it's a slightly different way of viewing the circumstances.
Mike, Mike, are you talking?
No, I'm sorry.
Let's just have it. Thank you. One thing I think worth bearing in mind is that there is a November special town meeting. If the funding situation changes, whether it's positive or negative, but hopefully if it's positive, the funds that do become available can be allocated to that process. What the advisory committee has suggested to the town is to take whatever savings it can realize from operations, from reducing the cost of operations and from reducing contributions to pensions and so forth, and put a substantial amount of that into a reserve fund that the advisory committee could allocate quickly in order to respond to needs that come up. And similarly, I think if you can take a conservative, very conservative perspective, as David is suggesting, then think about what priorities you would have for putting things back into play to restore some of those cuts in November in the case that we do that. So it's not like it's either or for the whole year. And particularly with the school system, November is a couple of months into school operations, but it's not the end of the year.
Yeah, and there are definitely some things we can turn on and turn off. Like classroom teachers, it's a little bit harder to add. Other supports, it's very possible to add mid-year, or restoring, budgets that are, supplies budgets or whatnot that we had held off on. So absolutely, there are definitely things we can think about there. Anything else here otherwise we're going to move into executive session. All right, well, thank you for all being here with us. It's always a pleasure to have you. I guess we will talk about a fair amount of this. Well, not a fair amount of this. I think this needs to get raised at the town school partnership, but since 7 out of 8 school committee members were here and most of the advisory subcommittee on schools was here, I appreciate that Ben and Mel and Melissa and the select board isn't here, but a lot of us are here. So I think it'd be useful to not start from zero when we have that conversation.